I didn't know my life was about to fracture over a single word. Okay. That was all I said. No yelling, no begging, no dramatic ultimatums. Just okay. At the time, Sebastian thought he'd won. He stood in my kitchen, arms crossed, jaw tight, telling me, very calmly, that if a weekend cabin trip with his recently divorced female friend made me uncomfortable, that was my insecurity, not his responsibility. He said I was being controlling. He said relationships shouldn't come with rules. He said if I trusted him, I wouldn't question his judgment. So I looked at him. I listened. And when he finished, I simply nodded and said, okay. What he didn't realize was that okay wasn't agreement. It was the sound of a boundary locking into place. Because the truth was, I had already bent myself into knots trying to be the reasonable one. I had swallowed my discomfort, explained myself calmly, offered compromises, checked my own instincts a dozen times to make sure I wasn't projecting fear where none existed. And still, he chose to walk past me. Hours later, my phone rang. It was someone I barely knew, Sebastian's coworker. And with one quiet sentence, she shattered the version of events I'd been gaslit into questioning. That cabin trip, it wasn't spontaneous, it wasn't innocent, and it definitely wasn't about supporting a friend. By the time I hung up, my hands were shaking, not from heartbreak, but from clarity. Suddenly, every dismissed concern, every accusation of insecurity, every moment I'd been made to feel crazy, snapped into focus. I wasn't paranoid, I wasn't controlling. I was being prepared as an exit. And Sebastian had expected me to play my role perfectly, smile politely, doubt myself, and quietly step aside while he tested another life without letting go of me. He thought I wouldn't notice. He was wrong. Because this isn't just a story about a cabin weekend. It's about how easily love can be rewritten as control when someone wants out without taking responsibility. And how the moment you stop begging to be understood is the moment the truth finally reveals itself. Before everything unraveled, before the word okay became a quiet ending instead of a compromise, my life was simple, not perfect, not flashy, but steady in a way I had worked hard to earn. My name is Brianna, and I was 32 when I met Sebastian. I work as a forklift operator at Rocky Mountain Building Supply in Colorado Springs. It's not a job people romanticize, but it's honest work. 2 years earlier, I'd moved here from Grand Rapids, Michigan, after the automotive parts factory I'd worked at for 6 years shut down without warning. One week I had a routine, coworkers I'd known for years, a future that felt predictable. The next, I was packing boxes and saying goodbye to a life that had collapsed overnight. The move wasn't easy. It took 4 months of applications, rejections, and drained savings before I landed this job. But once I did, things stabilized. The pay, just over $50,000 a year, was enough to breathe again. The benefits were solid. For the first time in my adult life, I could save money instead of calculating which bill could wait another week. I rented a modest 2-bedroom house about 10 minutes from work. Nothing fancy. Beige walls, slightly uneven floors. A small backyard I slowly turned into something livable. After years of bouncing between apartments in my 20s, that little house felt like proof that I was finally standing on my own 2 feet. I've never been the exciting type. I work hard, come home tired, cook simple meals, and enjoy quiet evenings. Weekends mean hiking trails, grocery runs, maybe a game on TV. People have always described me as reliable and steady. I used to hear that as praise, until I met Sebastian and started wondering when those words became synonyms for boring. Sebastian worked as a dental hygienist at a downtown clinic. He'd moved to Colorado Springs from Cheyenne, Wyoming, about 3 years earlier after finishing his degree. We met at a 4th of July barbecue hosted by my coworker's girlfriend. I remember noticing him immediately, not because he was loud or flashy, but because he had this effortless warmth. He laughed easily, made eye contact, drew people into conversations instead of dominating them. We started talking about hiking trails, and I was surprised, almost impressed, that he knew spots I hadn't explored yet, even though I'd lived there longer. That conversation stretched into the evening, then into exchange numbers, then into a first date that felt refreshingly uncomplicated. For 8 months, things were good, really good. We spent most weekends together, sometimes at his apartment, sometimes at my place. He met my parents when they visited for Christmas. I spoke to his mother on the phone when he called home on Sundays. We talked openly about work stress, past relationships, future plans. Not in a rushed way, but in that careful, hopeful tone people use when they think they're building something that might last. We even started talking, casually at first, about moving in together once his lease ended in the fall. Looking back, the signs were there. Small things, easy to dismiss. How he sometimes joked about feeling too young to be this settled. How he described my routines with a half smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. How he lit up when talking about people who made him feel alive. At the time, I told myself that stability wasn't a flaw. That excitement didn't have to mean chaos. I didn't know yet that Sebastian was already questioning whether the life we were building was enough for him. And I definitely didn't know that someone from his past was about to become the excuse he'd use to test that doubt without letting me go first. The first real crack didn't come with a fight. It came wrapped in casualness. Sebastian mentioned the cabin trip the way someone might mention a dentist appointment or a work meeting, almost as an afterthought. I was at his apartment, kneeling under the bathroom sink, tightening a connection on a leaky faucet. I'd done that kind of thing for him more times than I could count. He liked to joke that I was handy in a crisis, though the truth was, I just didn't like watching problems sit unfixed. "Oh," he said lightly, handing me the wrench. "I should probably tell you. I'll be busy Memorial Day weekend." I paused, still crouched there, the metal cool against my palm. Busy how? "I'm going to a cabin in the mountains with Zara." The name didn't land right away. It hovered there, unfamiliar. "Who's Zara?" I asked, frowning slightly. He waved a hand like it was obvious. "I've mentioned her before. We went to high school together back in Cheyenne. She moved to Denver about a year ago. Works in medical sales now." I tried to remember him ever talking about her. He'd shared stories about friends, exes, coworkers. But Zara? Nothing concrete surfaced. "So, it's a group thing?" I asked, assuming there were details I was missing. He shook his head. "No, just the two of us." That was when something inside me tightened. He kept talking, explaining that Zara's divorce had just been finalized, that she'd been struggling emotionally, that she needed a friend. He said it the way people do when they're certain their reasoning is airtight, like any discomfort I felt was something I'd need to work through on my own. I stayed quiet longer than usual, listening, watching his face. He didn't look guilty. He looked resolved. "A cabin weekend," I said slowly. "Just you and her?" "Yes," he replied, already bracing. "It's not romantic, Brianna. She's my friend." The words "not romantic" echoed oddly in my head. I chose my next words carefully. "I'm not comfortable with that." His shoulders stiffened immediately. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable. "It's not like that," he said. "She's going through a really hard time. I can't just abandon her." "I'm not asking you to," I replied. "I'm asking you to consider how this looks. A secluded cabin, overnight, with someone who's emotionally vulnerable. That's usually couple territory." That was when his tone changed. "You're overthinking it," he said. "And honestly, this sounds like insecurity." The words stung more than I expected. I tried again, suggested alternatives. Dinner in town, a movie, even a day trip. Each idea was shut down almost before I finished speaking. The cabin was already booked. The money was already spent. The timing was important. She needed to get away now. What bothered me most wasn't that he disagreed with me. It was how quickly my concern became framed as a character flaw. Every explanation he offered came back to the same point. If I trusted him, this wouldn't be a problem. If I were more secure, I'd understand. If I loved him enough, I wouldn't make this difficult. And somewhere in the middle of that conversation, as he stood there telling me I was making him feel judged, I realized something unsettling. This wasn't a discussion. It was a justification. And I was already being positioned as the unreasonable one for questioning a boundary that felt, to me, painfully obvious. The moment everything truly shifted wasn't loud. There was no shouting, no slammed doors, no dramatic declarations. It happened quietly, through pauses, deflections, and the subtle way Sebastian's eyes stopped meeting mine when the questions got too close. We were sitting across from each other at my kitchen table that night. The faucet was fixed, forgotten now. Dinner had gone cold between us. The air felt heavier than it should have for a conversation that, according to him, wasn't a big deal. "I trust you," I said finally, choosing my words with care, "but I don't trust her intentions." His head snapped up. "You don't get to judge my friends." "I'm not judging," I replied. "I'm using common sense. A cabin weekend for two is intimate, especially when one person is newly divorced and emotionally vulnerable." He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "I've known Zara for 15 years, Brianna. I think I can tell the difference between friendship and romantic interest." "Has she ever expressed interest in you?" I asked. The question hung there. Too long. Well, maybe back in high school, he said slowly. But that was over a decade ago. People change. That's not what I asked, I said, my voice steady even as my chest tightened. Has she expressed interest recently? Another pause. I mean, he began, eyes flicking away. She might have some feelings, but that doesn't mean I'm going to act on them. There it was. The admission landed like a dull thud in my stomach. So you're going to spend 3 days alone in a secluded cabin, I said quietly, with someone who has feelings for you. You're twisting this, he shot back. Our relationship should be strong enough to handle me supporting a friend. I stared at him, trying to reconcile the man I thought I knew with the one sitting across from me now. Strong doesn't mean boundaryless. That's exactly what control sounds like, he said, his voice rising. You're basically telling me I can't have female friends. No, I replied. I'm telling you that romantic getaways with people who have feelings for you cross a line. There's a difference. It's not romantic, he snapped. Why do you keep calling it that? Because that's what it is, I said. If she wanted platonic support, she'd suggest coffee or a group hangout, not an overnight mountain cabin. The conversation spiraled after that. Every concern I raised was reframed as jealousy. Every boundary became an accusation. He spoke about freedom, about not wanting to repeat patterns he'd seen in other people's failed relationships. He told me he wasn't going to be controlled. I remember gripping the edge of the table, my fingers numb, my heartbeat loud in my ears. Setting boundaries isn't control, I said softly. It's respect for what we're trying to build. He stood up then, pacing. I'm going regardless of how you feel. And if you can't handle that, maybe we're not as compatible as I thought. The words settled like dust after something shatters. Okay, I said. He stopped pacing. Okay? Yes, I repeated. Okay. I didn't argue. I didn't plead. I didn't cry. I just watched as relief washed over his face, the relief of someone who believed the problem had been solved. What he didn't see was the shift happening inside me. Because acceptance isn't always surrender. Sometimes it's the moment you stop trying to convince someone to choose you. That night, he kissed me goodbye like everything was normal, texted me the next morning like nothing had changed, continued showing up for dinners, holding my hand, talking about work. And all the while, the image of him packing for that cabin weekend with another woman made my stomach churn. I told myself to breathe, to wait, to observe. I didn't know yet that the real fracture wouldn't come from the trip itself, but from the lies woven around how it came to be. For the next 3 weeks, I lived in a strange limbo, one foot in the relationship I thought I had, the other hovering over a reality I wasn't ready to accept. On the surface, nothing changed. Sebastian still came over for dinner, still texted me good morning, still leaned into me on the couch, like my unease was some invisible thing he didn't have to acknowledge. If anything, he was gentler, more affectionate in small, strategic ways that made me question myself. And I hated that it worked. At night, though, when the house went quiet, my mind wouldn't stop replaying that conversation. Every pause, every deflection, every time he'd chosen Zara's emotional needs over my clearly stated boundary. I kept asking myself the same question from 100 different angles. Am I really being unreasonable? I'd never considered myself jealous. I'd never told a partner who they could or couldn't be friends with. I believed in trust, autonomy, adult relationships built on mutual respect. So why did this feel so wrong? The answer always came back the same, because I wasn't being asked to trust him. I was being asked to silence my instincts. That Sunday evening, I decided to try again. Not to argue, but to find common ground. We were relaxed, sitting on my couch, the soft glow of the lamp casting familiar shadows on the walls. I've been thinking about our conversation, I said carefully, and I want to find a compromise that works for both of us. His body tensed instantly. We already talked about this, he said. I'm going. Just hear me out, I replied. Okay? A reluctant nod. I laid out 3 options, calmly, deliberately. I could come along and sleep on the couch. They could make it a day trip instead of staying overnight. Or we could plan a weekend together the following week and ask Zara to postpone. Each suggestion was rejected almost before I finished speaking. She's not comfortable around new people. A day trip defeats the purpose. She needs this now. By the time I finished, my chest felt tight. You're not considering any of these, I said quietly. It feels like her feelings matter more than mine. She's in crisis, Brianna, he snapped. She's dealing with a divorce. You're just jealous. The word hit harder this time. I'm not jealous, I said. I'm asking for appropriate boundaries. That's when his tone shifted, sharpened. You know what? He said. This is exactly the kind of controlling behavior that destroyed her marriage. Her ex wouldn't let her have close friendships either. I'm not going to repeat that. I stared at him, stunned. You're comparing me to an ex-spouse you barely know? I'm saying I won't be that guy, he replied. Our relationship should be strong enough to handle this. Would you be okay? I asked, my voice steady, despite the pounding in my chest. If I went on a cabin weekend with a recently divorced man who probably had feelings for me? That's different. How? Because I trust your judgment, he said quickly. I'm secure. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. So it's okay for you, I said, but not for me. He didn't answer. He just repeated that he was going, and that how I handled it was my responsibility. That night I barely slept. Sometime after midnight, I started scrolling back through our messages. Dates, details, timelines. That's when I noticed it. 3 weeks earlier, he'd told me Zara had invited him and already booked the cabin. But in a conversation the previous weekend, he'd casually mentioned helping pick out the place online and sending her money for his share. The lie was small, but it changed everything. This wasn't an obligation he'd reluctantly agreed to. It was a plan he actively participated in, and then presented to me as something he couldn't back out of. When I asked him about it, he brushed it off, said the details didn't matter. But they did, because when someone lies about how a situation started, it usually means they're hiding why it started in the first place. Once I noticed the lie, I couldn't unsee it. It sat between us like a third presence, quiet, heavy, impossible to ignore. Sebastian continued acting as if everything were normal, but every affectionate gesture now felt rehearsed. Every reassurance rang hollow. I didn't confront him right away, not because I was afraid, but because I needed to understand the full shape of what I was dealing with. At work, I mentioned the situation to my coworker Wade. He'd been married for 15 years and had a way of cutting through emotional fog without being cruel. If my husband told me he was going on a romantic weekend with another woman, Wade said, not even hesitating, I'd pack his bags for him. I laughed weakly, but his words settled something in me. You're not crazy, he added. If it were innocent, he wouldn't be fighting this hard for that exact scenario. The closer the trip got, the worse the tension became. Sebastian grew increasingly dismissive of my discomfort, framing it as something I needed to work through. Meanwhile, his family began chiming in, subtly at first. His mother asked during a phone call whether I was feeling anxious lately. His sister joked that I should try being more spontaneous. The message was clear. I was the problem. By Friday morning, he was gone. I didn't hear from him all weekend. But I didn't need to. My sister sent me screenshots Saturday morning. Photos from Instagram and Facebook. Public, unfiltered, undeniable. Sebastian and Zara cooking dinner together in the cabin kitchen, his hand resting casually on her lower back. Coffee on the porch, sitting pressed together on the same chair. Hiking photos, hands clasped for balance. A campfire shot, her head resting on his shoulder, his arm wrapped around her. Every image screamed intimacy. His captions were vague, much-needed mountain time, good friends, and fresh air. But hers were telling. Perfect weekend with my favorite travel buddy, finally making time for what really matters. Something inside me went quiet. When he texted Sunday evening, had a great time, see you tomorrow, I didn't respond. Monday night, he came over like nothing had happened. How was your weekend? He asked brightly. Honestly, I said, terrible. I spent it wondering if my boyfriend was falling for someone else. He rolled his eyes. You're being dramatic. Nothing happened. I saw the photos. His expression changed instantly. What photos? The ones where you're holding hands, cuddling, going on what looks like a couple's retreat. That was just normal friend stuff, he said. You're reading too much into it. Normal friends don't cuddle by campfires. While we were talking, his phone buzzed repeatedly. Is that Zara? I asked. Yes, he said quickly. She's just checking in. Can I see the messages? No, he snapped. That's private, and the fact that you're asking proves you don't trust me. The fact that you won't show me proves there's something to hide. That was when he exploded, accusing me of paranoia, control, insecurity, saying I was ruining the relationship, that he couldn't be with someone who didn't trust his judgment. Maybe we need a break, he said coldly. I need space to figure out what I want. The next morning, Wade showed me something that removed all doubt. A new Facebook post. Sebastian and Zara at a restaurant Sunday night. Captioned, date night with this amazing woman. When I called him, he said it was a joke. A joke, I repeated. After a romantic weekend? You're blowing this out of proportion, he said. We're just friends. 3 days later, I hadn't heard from him. But I heard from Mara, his coworker. Brianna, she said quietly over the phone, I think you should know something. He's been planning that trip for over a month. He talked about it like it was going to help him figure things out. Figure out what? He's been saying you're too settled, too serious, that Zara makes him feel excited again. The truth finally stood fully exposed. The trip wasn't about support. It was an exit strategy, and I had been cast as the controlling villain so he could walk away without guilt.